Hello, I'm Jean Harvey. In this video, I will carry on with the design methodology, DCDV. It is following up directly on the first video on that topic, which presents a global, logical overview of the methodology. This video will be more technical. It accompanies the book in the chapter 10 in particular, which looked at the methodology and its technical aspects. I will use two examples, one simple, simplistic even, one complex services, with the idea of illustrating the complex concept with a simple example, and then referring you to the book example where you can, at your own leisure and at your own speed, read the methodology and the technique and practice a little bit, of course. So the concepts here. CTS deployment, critical to satisfaction deployment on metrics, CTQDC, and on sub-processes. Concept generation, the creativity part of the design process. The define phase, the characterize phase are analytical and rigorous. The design phase has to include a creativity step, or actually a series of creativity steps, where you think out of the box, you generate ideas to be combined into an eventual workable concept. Improving the best concept, the idea of iteration, and the techniques of house of quality, house 1, house 2, and the Pew metrics. Again, following in direct sequence chapter 10 of the book. So you will recall from earlier videos the define phase with its specific phase illustrated in a couple of videos. And I will first focus here on the characterize, DC, characterize, and then on the design phase of the methodology with the two working examples that I mentioned earlier. I will not get into the verify part in this video. So let's start here. Customers, who are they? What do they do? And as a result, what do they need and want? Are we going to measure it? What are the target values that we have to reach? And what is it that we have to do to reach those targets? And of all the things we have to do, what's critical? This will drive the design part of the process. So let's start here with, again, two examples. You will recall the FAST technique, which generate all the processes, the metrics, and the customer needs, or CTSs, critical to satisfaction. You will also recall from an earlier video the notion of customer activity cycle, where you understand, you segment, target the market segment, and then describe what they do in what we call the customer corridor, or the customer activity cycle. Processes impact the metrics. The metrics are correlated to the customer need. But we design it that way. It works that way. We design it that way. The two examples that I'll be using are the one from the book on Financial Planning Associates, FPA, and a simplistic example of designing a process for making a cup of coffee. I will alternate between one and the other. And when I'm talking about FPA example, the slides I have are directly from the book. So if you're reading as you go, you can stop me, go through the book, take your time, come back to the video as additional support. Let's assume that I want a good cup of coffee. What do I want? Take the Jean Harvey market segment, if you like. I like a cup of coffee that wakes me up, tastes good. How do I know it? I just like it. It tastes good. I know this is not very useful for the operator, the guy producing or the gal producing the coffee. But to me, tastes good is clear need. I like it hot, smell good, cheap, the right size, and all. And of all these things, the most important, as I get up in the morning, wakes me up. Or as I'm very tired, wakes me up. At night, well, if I'm about to go to bed, maybe wake me up is not necessarily such a good idea. Maybe just hot smells good, but does not work. Maybe this inverse does not wake me up. Who knows? So let's assume that we've done the customer activity cycle. We've looked at our market segments, competition, as discussed in the video that presents an overview of the book. And those are the needs, and this is the Pareto diagram with the familiar shape that you already know. Now the characterize phase proceeds to first identify metrics. Those are clear to me, but they're not necessarily measurable. And whoever operates and must produce this repetitively needs to be able to measure, not only through yearly customer satisfaction survey, but you got to be able to measure it as he or she is performing it. So how do you measure wakes me up? Well, quantity of caffeine is probably a good metric. How do you measure tastes good? Well, quantity of Arabicas, quantity of Colombian that you have in here, or percentage Colombian. How do you measure hot? Temperature. Temperature when? Temperature as it's on the heater. Temperature. Temperature when and where? Temperature on the stove. Temperature in the microwave oven. More like temperature when I put it to my lips. So be specific. It's got to be measurable. You need a measurement system that's repeatable, reproducible, and you need to be able to set targets that correspond to the customer perception of it. So you generate, in a first step, indicators. How could I measure this? And then what you'd like to do is select the most important indicators. And this is why you use what we call, this is a simplified version of the house of quality. This is a simple matrix without the refinement that we can put to it. You've got the customer needs with their weights here, and you've got a number of indicators which I generated through brainstorming with a couple of people. Hot. How can we measure this? And people will throw in idea. You use the proverbial post-it to write down the metrics. And you use then this matrix to make sure that you've got enough, you're measuring all the important customer needs, that you're not getting lost with too many things, too many indicators measuring the same thing. And the technique, of course, is the correlation 931. The color code here is red, direct correlation. One is a measure of the other. Yellow, average correlation. Green, slight correlation. Blank, no relationship whatsoever. Technically, to calculate an indicator of the importance of each of these metrics, we use the 931 formula, and we calculate for each indicator the cross product as we go down every column to get a total. 9 times 20 plus 9 times 30 and so on, and you get a total value. The bigger the value, the more important the metric. But of course this is all relative to other metrics, so you put it in percentage. You take the total of the line here and you put it in percentage. That's easily done in Excel, and you get a list of metrics in order of importance. The goal of this is to deploy the customer needs into a complete set of metrics, as few as possible, which collectively measure all the important customer need, as well as an indicator of importance, translating these weights into weights for the indicators, the metrics here. So then you set target value. Temperature or quantity of caffeine is a bullseye type of measure. Too much, too little, not good. There is a soft spot here, a tolerance, a voice of customer. We call this the voice of the customer. Volume depends on the customer. In my case, the more the merrier. the more the better. Cost, the lower the better. So for each of those, you decide what type of metric is. More is better, less is better, or bullseye. And you will eventually set target value that correspond to customer perception. So there is a cross correlation here to be done, measuring the technical value, measuring customer perception, and ensuring true cross correlation, whether or not the two metrics, the metrics and the customer perception, work together or inversely. If you're measuring the right thing correctly, whenever your metric improves, the customer perception should improve as well. Now, observe this here. Percentage Colombian, quantity of caffeine. Assuming that there's a lot of caffeine in Colombian coffee, then this is correlated to this. Weight of coffee. The more coffee grounds you put in, of course, the more caffeine you'll get. So these things here are quite correlated, to the point where you see they correlate with the same metrics. Let me work through one column. In my view here, temperature at first sip has a moderate impact on the taste. If it's cold, of course, you can't taste anything. It's got a light impact on the wakes me up. It's not the temperature that wakes you up, it's the caffeine. But then, very cold, maybe it doesn't get through your body as fast. Maybe. Hot, of course. Temperature is a direct measure of hot. Medium correlation on the smell. If it's cold, it doesn't smell anything. Impact on cheap. Well, I could have put a green or nothing here, but I figured that the more you heat it, the more it costs you of energy. So there is a slight implication here on the price. There you go. So if you look again, Colombian quantity of caffeine, weight of coffee, you see that they correlate exactly to the same indicator. So in other words, you will, why not simplify and eliminate at least one of those? The idea is to have as few indicators as possible that measure everything or most of the things that are important to the customer. So in a second iteration, my effort is to right size the matrix. I will take this out. Not that caffeine is not important, but the two other metrics measure it very well. And I do not have an indicator of taste. Well, because it's harder to measure. So it's tempting just to measure what's easy to measure. Well, if taste is important, no doubt it is. Whenever I go to a town, a city I don't know, a country I don't know, I'll ask the cabbie on the way from the airport, what's the best place to have a good cup of coffee here? They know. And the restaurants know as well that if you have good coffee, you'll sell the rest. Many taxi driver will pick the restaurant on the basis of the coffee, and they work long hours. So in the second iteration, I remove quantity of caffeine and I added a taste score, for which I would of course have to develop a scale, define the criteria, develop a perceptual scale, validate it to the point where two people tasting the same cup of coffee can rate it the same way. And I get a matrix like this, and I go over the calculation again, finding here that percentage Colombian and the weight of the coffee, both correlated to caffeine, come up very strong, with the taste score indeed coming up with my correlation value as much, and I'm not an expert on coffee, and this will give me a Pareto. Most important to least important, and cumulative importance rating. At this point I have deployed customer need, soft perceptual, into measurable indicators, and I have a weight associated with each of those. That will take me to what I actually have to do. The process that I have to do is decomposed in the fast diagram, as you know. The two-step house of quality then technique consists to market research, customers activity cycle, the customer needs here, technical characteristics or metrics generated here. Forget about the roof here. I don't have a roof. The roof is really the correlation that I showed earlier, but I will not get into that any deeper. From this, I have the important metrics. I start with the important needs. I come with the important metrics. Those will go into house 2. And the fast diagram will go as well into house 2, with the goal of separating in all the sub-processes identified in the fast diagram, the vital few from the trivial many. This will terminate the characterize phase, from which I will go to the design phase, focusing on the critical few sub-processes and the critical few metric with their target value that I've identified in the characterize phase. Now the fast diagram here, prepare coffee. As you know, I will not repeat the technique. Select coffee beans, buy, select the quantity, grind, heat water, filter the water to the coffee grounds, and pour. This could be decomposed, but that at my level today, this does a good job. Which of those is most important to produce a cup of coffee that tastes good, that wakes me up, that's hot? Well, this is the purpose of house 2. The technique is exactly the same, but the parameters on the X and Y axes are not the same, of course. What you have here on top are the sub-processes from the fast diagram, directly coming on top here. What you have on the side are the metrics, or technical characteristics, with their weight. Where does that come from? Calculated in house 1, at the bottom of house 1 in percentage. What is the impact of grinding the beans, for example, on the percentage Colombian? Of course, nothing at all, none. On the weight of the coffee, well, it's in and out and you grind everything, so you end up with the same weight anyway. What's the impact on the coarseness? Well, of course, grinding is a direct determinant of the degree of fineness, coarseness of the coffee. What's the impact on the taste? Well, it does, so far as I know, if you grind finely, you'll get more of the flavor out. Too fine, you may actually lose some. I'm not an expert. So the correlation here, of course, and the output is as good as the knowledge that I put into it. In this case, very little. I'm more of a coffee drinker than a coffee maker. That tells me, according to, if those correlations are correct, that selecting the quantity of coffee I put in is critical, because it's got a critical impact on the amount of coffee that goes in, which has an impact, as we know, on caffeine, and it does have a great impact on the score, quite obviously. So that is the most critical function. And you can Pareto this again, having the most important subfunction, and not wasting time with heating. The way you heat, not the temperature achieved, but the way you heat water does not matter. The way you buy the coffee does not matter. What you buy does have an impact, and the way you pour it in this case does not either. If you're in a restaurant and it's a different story. If you're in the back office and you pour it in the back office and it's cold by the time you drink it, that's another story. So within the framework of the hypotheses that I've given you, those are the important functions. I've identified, I didn't get into detail here, the target value to reach on each of the technical characteristics. I am ready to move on to the design phase. In which phase? I will divide my efforts into 2 big steps. First, I'll do a high-level design. Find, if you will work with me on a Google Earth analogy, a Google Earth metaphor, I'll go from exploring very high, very broad concepts. I'll take it down to about 5,000 meters. Pick the best at this level. Then zoom in to Google Street View on that. I will explore again at high level, first major sub-phase. I will pick the most promising area and zoom in to design and end up with a detailed process blueprint ready to implement. design. Those are the sub-processes in the fast diagram. Notice that those that were not critical, I left out, I leave it blank, and I am here in ID generation. The ID generation phase is a brainstorming phase where a team of colleagues, generally involved in the process from the beginning, will, for each of those selected critical functions, ask themselves what are ways that this function can be achieved. The answer to that, in a first kick at the can, must fit on a post-it. They sit in silence and they'll say, well, pick 100% Colombian, pick the cheapest mix, pick pre-ground anonymous merchant mix. Van Hout is a brand that is well known around here. Single serving cups are the little couplets that you get and that you can put in special machine. Those would be ideas that are generated by the team, silently writing, putting the post-its in front of them, not talking with each other. When they have no more ideas, they can look at the other post-its and keep generating ideas. I've got 6 here. It is easy to get 20, depending on the size of the process you're looking at. And again, when you get a 20, sometimes they can be regrouped and summarized in fewer ideas. How can you grind? Well, you can grind fine, coarse, 1 cup at a time, or grind for many days use, for 1 day's use. Rotary blade stuff. Now notice that these tend to be mutually exclusive. Here in grinding, look at these boxes here. Fine or coarse are mutually exclusive. 1 cup at a time or grinding for 1 day's use are mutually exclusive. You can make a choice here, one of those, and again, rotary blade and stone grinder, one or the other. The boxes reflect mutually exclusive category. So you can grind fine, 1 cup at a time using a rotary blade. So those can be combined. Filtering water through coffee. Drip and funnel. Well, eat and recirculate. Eat and vacuum aspiration, again another technique. Pressure water through compacted ground. Those are ways through which the hot water and the coffee grounds can be mixed together and then separated later on. Those are mutually exclusive. You pick one, the others cannot be applied. Now, what I need is a process concept, meaning one way to do this combined with one way of doing that, with one way of doing this, and so on. Again, this is a creativity phase. There are many, many combinations. 6 here times 6 here, there are far too many. So we go intuitively. The team gets around here and they try to mix ideas that seem to make sense together, that have some sort of holistic quality. And they give a name to this concept. Let's say I'll go with single serving cups. I mean, everything included ground, so you don't have to select the quantity, it is defined, you don't have to grind, and you can only inject pressure water through it, hole on top, hole on the bottom, pressured water, and that would be one concept. You can go to the luxury concept, lots of Colombian here, very high quantity, use a distributor, makes sense. If you grind 1 cup at a time, then you cannot heat and recirculate in this type of percolator system. So there's limitation. What you do after generating the ideas is combine ideas that seems to make sense. This becomes a process concept, a high-level description of how the process would work. You pick the ideas so that there's some sort of logic behind the assembly of these sub-processes. You give the concept a name that will make it vivid, so that the team can later manipulate it as a clear mental model, a clear mental image, an entity to be appraised and compared with other entities. Because at this point, it's a vision of the mind. So the crisper the name, the most vivid the name, the easier for the team to manipulate it afterwards. Here are a few examples of possible concepts. Deluxe, 100% Colombian, 15 milligrams, and a distributor, a fixed quantity distributor. You would use fine, 1 cup at a time with a stone grinder, and you would use pressure grinder. I call this the deluxe concept, presumably the most expensive, producing presumably a very good cup of coffee. Real bargain, well, I go for cheap, small quantity, a rotary blade, which is cheaper, again, goes very fast, and heat and recirculate, where you make many cups of coffee, make a lot of coffee fairly cheap. So I call it real bargain. So we have two process concepts here. And single cups, the one I described earlier, single cup, hot water injected in sealed cup, and I call this easy does it. You buy something standard, couplets, and you inject water through it, push a button, it's done. Ease is probably the factor here. Now, you could, of course, people knowledgeable in coffee would come up with all sorts of new ideas. ID generation is followed by concept generation, which is an integration of ideas, and then description. The previous diagrams are not very visual, not very easy to interpret. So it's essential that you describe in words the general flow of the process concept. Again, process concept is a general high-level view of how things will work. In this case, deluxe, we select the freshest coffee beans. We grind to a powder, extra fine, 15 milligrams for each cup, obtained through a distributor, and so on. So this is a process description. We do that for all the concepts. And now we are in a position to compare. We've generated ideas, we've combined them, we've generated concepts. This is a creativity phase. Out of the box, there's no censure here, there's no selection, we just think what seems to make sense without calculation. It is time to fall back now on reality. Compare the concepts on a number of criteria, reflecting various goals that we're trying to achieve. This is where the Pew matrix, Pew concept selection matrix, comes in. Let us now switch back to a more complex example. And again, I am using chapter 10, example from the book, FPA, Financial Planning Associates, training them in financial notions and they use in technology as well to invest directly online. So I have here a description. This is the FAST diagram, conduct needs assessment. It's a training system, needs assessment, develop training support, and so on. What we have here, before we go for ID generation, is a description of the mission of each of these sub-processes. You will recall the notion of process mission from earlier chapters. Well, sub-processes in the FAST diagram are processes. As such, they have a mission. So the mission of the overall process is decomposed in missions for each of the sub-processes. It's very useful to write fully, at length here, what this sub-process must do. It helps the team to generate ideas about how to do it. Conduct needs assessment. The goal of that is to understand and capture the true needs and preferences of the client in a painless way, to ensure that everyone involved in the design and delivery of the training package will be focused on a unique, accurate target. This sets the stage for a team to sit down. Okay, how can we do that? What are alternate? It's better than just a verb and a noun. It forces you to think a little bit, and having spelled out what it has to do, you set the table so that people can now think about ways to do it. And again, in the book you have more details, various ideas. How do you conduct need? And I will not get into the specific example described in the book, but you see here the combination and the names given to each of the concepts, and a detailed description of each of the concepts that they have generated, just as I illustrated for the coffee example. This concludes, once you've achieved a description of concept, the first iteration of concept generation. Concept generation is iterative. You generate a number of concepts. Creative phase. You go one step further into selection, which is the best. But of course, the best is the best of 5, 6, 7. But there are hundreds of combinations, and the best can certainly be improved. This is what we call iteration. We take the best, we forget the others. We take the best and we start back to creativity to generate improvements. Ways to make what works better, and ways to minimize the weaknesses of that idea. So you're back generating ideas, not starting from scratch, starting from the best of iteration 1 and trying to make it better. You generate the second wave of concepts based on the best of the first iteration. And you go back to the Pew matrix to select the best. And so on, until you've achieved more or less a consensus in the group that this is the best we can do at 5,000 meters. We are ready afterwards to go to detailed design and land on the blueprint that will look like a mapping, except that it is not what is, it is what is going to be. Let's now look at the Pew matrix. It is a matrix again, where you have the concept. This is from the FPA example. You've got the number, Club Med, iTouch, quarterback, and so on, the 5 concepts generated. Here you have a number of criteria on which the concepts will be compared. The criteria come from the client. The criteria fall into 4 categories. The client's criteria, as set in House of Quality, House 1, the targets that we've set. Employees are, of course, very involved. The way you do things not only impacts the customer, it impacts the employee that does it, of course, and his personal value proposition. Shareholders, of course, are impacted. The way you do things will determine the success or the failure of the business in the end. And the cost, of course, so they are. So the criteria those are already defined and those are added later on. The 4th category, not here, is management restrictions, management constraints put on the team. Not shown here. You would have, for example, any projects given to a team will come with constraints. It's got to be done by April 15th. Your budget for this should not exceed so much. It should fit into our ERP, the SAP or whatever you've got. A number of constraints will, again, help us select which is the best concept here. Those criteria are weighted so that a concept that scores very high on a big weight criteria is more likely to be selected than one that doesn't. So the general idea is like House of Quality, if you like, in terms of calculation. Now, an important aspect of the Pew matrix. Here you have 5 concepts. The principle, the operating principle of the matrix is to pick one of those as the reference point, the standard, against which the other concepts will be compared. You pick one as the standard, You see the S's here, or the reference point. And once you go through for each criteria with plus is better than the standard, and a minus is worse than the standard on that criteria. You could be more sophisticated and go with plus plus, much better, minus minus, very much worse, and so on. Simplify here, it's complex enough, plus minuses. You pick a standard and you go for each line. Most of the time it will be fairly clear to the team. Sometimes there'll be debate and discussion, sometimes there'll be strong disagreement. Where if half the team says, well, we think this is worse in terms of cost, and the other half say we think this is better, then we put a question mark and we get more data. We do more analysis, we simulate, we build prototype, whatever we have to do to get the data right. But typically 90% or more will be fairly clear. So you go like this. And then, of course, at the end, you calculated the weighted sum of equals. And equal, of course, whenever you put an S here, it means that this concept is similar or equal, directly comparable to the standard for that criteria. So what you want to do is take the difference between the advantages minus the inconvenience, and that gives you the marginal value of that concept, and you would see that Club Med here as more, compared to all the other four concepts, has more advantages than inconvenience, and is the best of the five. Now, Club Med is not perfect. It's got minuses. It is the best of the five, but it can be improved. The end of the first iteration is once you have selected the best of the five. You move on to a second creativity phase. You're back to design with the specific task of making the best better, to improve the best. We forget the other four concepts. We start with Club Med, as defined earlier. We sit down and we ask the team, what modifications, how could you tweak Club Med to reinforce, make the advantage better, its strength better, and minimize its inconvenience, or even better, transform its inconvenience into advantages. Post-its. The ideas, of course, now are not all over the place. You have centered the analysis, let's say from 50,000 meters down to 10,000 meters. So the ideas are all around. They're tweaking, they're nuance, small adjustments to various aspects. Before moving to the second creativity phase, it is essential to share the result of the first iteration with top management. So typically, after the day's over, the team will present to top management not only the results achieved, but the way it was done. This will trigger all sorts of response from management, of course. If you have all the stakeholders present, procurement, quality, marketing, legal, and so on, they will see limits and objections. They will have other ideas that haven't been considered. The team will take notes. And a side effect, not a side effect really, a fundamental effect of this is to give each of the stakeholder a voice, the possibility to express with the colleagues present the limitations, the ideas that he or she sees. Those ideas can be taken into account in a second iteration. In other words, as you iteration through iteration, as you manage technical consensus, you also manage social consensus. The time invested up front will reduce considerably resistance in the field. You get buy-in that way through open, transparent consultation, not one-on-one at the coffee machine, but in an open level playing field. So, starting from the Club Med concept, imagine that present this half an hour at night, take notes of management ideas and fears, sleep on it, come back the next day, brainstorming. How could we improve the Club Med concepts? In silence again. Ideas to make these pluses more plus, to reduce these minuses, mitigate their effect, or even transform the weaknesses into strength. So the team is back writing in silence, looking at the post-its of one another, and generating variants, small changes, starting from Club Med. The other 4 concepts have been forgotten. So you've got the Club Med original. Notice one thing here. Those are the functions in the fast diagram. The yellow one are the critical function. The other white ones were not used for design. But they still have to be done. So the Club Med original concept here is completed by spelling out how each of these functions, the non-critical ones, will be done. This is decided in order with a view to harmonizing the complete Club Med concept, applying the unifying principle, the common thread that led the team to create this concept, and harmonizing all the activities so that it makes sense together. So you see IDs generated here, which will change one bit or the other of that concept, and we generate 4 variants. Club Med Account Executive Calling, Club Med iTech, Club Med GeoTeams, whatever they are. See the book. Those are, again, we have 5 concepts, but the original 5s were all over the place. We've picked the best, and we've looked at 5 concepts around it. And now we are about to go back to the Pew matrix to pick the best of the 5. So we're going in a funnel here, slowly. Iteration through iteration. Trying to make things better and converge. And we are back to this is done and finished. The only takeaway here is the Club Med, which is brought to the second iteration as the new reference point, the new standard. And we compare plus and minus until we find the best of the 5. This will complete the second iteration and will typically, at the end of the day, bring top management back together with presentation of the result and the way it was reached. Again, discussions, ideas, reactions of all kinds. Next day, iteration. How many? Until we converge. Until a shared vision emerge. It's not a high resolution, but it's clear enough that at 5,000 meters, say at a given level of detail, the top management team is on board. Not that each and every one of their ideas have been accepted, but they have been voiced. They were given an opportunity to make their case. And if the idea is not accepted, they know why. And they know that other ideas were made. Some will be included, others not. Social consensus. Lack thereof is a fundamental cause of delays in launching new services, new processes, and recall and failures and relaunch and have to do it again. Take a little more time. Do invest your best people and your best minds. And it is an iterative process. And it does require a rigorous methodology. Otherwise, it will not take place. The team, typically without such a methodology, will take the original idea from the boss, try to understand what the boss meant, not explore at a very high level, but start investing in the detailed design, which is the next phase. The detailed design here is that phase where you start zooming in. What you have in the methodology is a 1, 2, 3 paragraph description. This has to be translated into a detailed flow of the process. And with this, of course, again, think as you're planning a trip in Google Earth. Once you reach Street View, it's much more operational, and you see things that you hadn't before from a high-level view. Same thing here. Each of those activities, once the team now gets into the detail, all sorts of new questions arise. What supplier will we use? Where do we find them? How can we negotiate a contract? Employee, do we have the right skills? Do we have to train people? How much will we pay them? IT, do we need to make a patch between these two systems, get a new system? Installations, what sort of equipment will we need? Where do we get it? So as, of course, the detailed design phase is very time consuming. But if you've taken the time to build a consensus around the shared vision, let the shared vision emerge, you've, by investing a few days, you've saved so much time and so much money in resistance and increased by so much the odds of success. I will not get into the design phase, into the detailed design phase here. This will complete this overview of the characterize and design phase of the DCDV methodology. Very technical video. Go back to the book, and maybe as you read the book, come back to the video to clarify some points. Thank you for your attention.